Okay, let's unpack this. We are doing a deep dive into 3 days in July 1863, 3 days that really did reshape the entire trajectory of American history. We've got a huge stack of source material here. Military analyses, article, historical accounts, all pointing to the Battle of Gettysburg.
And our mission today is really for you, the listener.
Yeah.
You know the basics, right? You know the Union won. What we want to get into is the why. The specific chain of events, the political pressures that make historians all agree this was the turning point, the big one.
And the thing you have to anchor this all to, I think, is just the sheer scale of the human cost. Our sources hammer this home again and again. Gettysburg was the bloodiest battle of the entire war.
Yeah.
We're talking over 50,000 combined casualties. That level of violence, it tells you something had to break.
It does. I mean, when casualties get that high, it's not just a battle anymore. It's a moment where an army is essentially broken strategically. It was the failure of the Confederacy's biggest gamble.
So let's set the stage for that gamble. You have Confederate General Robert E. Lee. He's fresh off some massive victories.
Crushing victories. Chancellorsville, most recently.
Exactly. And he marches his entire army of Northern Virginia into Pennsylvania. Why is he there? I mean, that's a huge logistical risk, so far from home.
It was Lee's second invasion of the North, and honestly, it was an act of desperation. Pure political and logistical desperation that was sort of masked as military confidence.
Desperation?
Yeah, the Confederacy was starving, supplies were shot, the Western theater was looking more and more vulnerable. So on one level, Lee just needed to get his army out of Virginia to find food. That was the simple tactical reason.
But there was a much grander political vision here, wasn't there? This wasn't just a supply raid.
Not at all, no. This was the Confederacy's last, best shot to win the war outright.
By forcing some kind of intervention?
Precisely. Lee's strategic goals were incredibly high stakes. The main objective was to just break the will of the North. He wanted to seize a major city, Harrisburg, maybe even Philadelphia, a victory like that, so dramatic, on Northern soil.
It would have fueled the anti-war movement.
Exactly. It was the Confederacy's final Hail Mary. He hoped it would force two things. First, cripple Lincoln politically before the 1864 election. And second, and this is the really vital part, force Britain and France to finally officially recognize the Confederacy as an independent nation.
And that recognition means everything.
Everything. Alliances, loans, military aid. It could have completely cut off Union credit. If that had happened, the war was over.
So the Union absolutely had to stop this invasion. You have to remember, Northern morale was, well, it was in the gutter.
Right. They just had a string of pretty demoralizing losses.
So the pressure on Major General George Meade, who, by the way, was only given command of the army days before the battle, it must have been just astronomical.
It was. The sources show Lincoln had actually drafted an order to replace Meade just days before the battle.
Wow.
It just shows you the lack of confidence, the almost existential stakes resting on this one single fight. This was about political survival.
Let's shift from that political desperation to the sheer scale of the fighting, because the sources, they paint a terrifying picture of those 3 days.
They really do. The fighting was fierce from the very first day, July 1st. But day 2, July 2nd, that's when the brutality was really established.
And what's so fascinating is how much it all came down to geography. Tiny pieces of land.
Places that are now legendary, right? Little Round Top, the Peach Orchard, Devil's Den.
Exactly. And for anyone who knows the battle, those aren't just names. They're the whole game.
That's right. The Union had this brilliant fishhook-shaped defensive position on the high ground of Cemetery Ridge. And the Confederate plan was to smash the flanks of that fishhook.
Which brings us to a place like Little Round Top, the extreme left flank of the Union line.
And the defense of that hill was one of the most decisive moments of the entire war. You have Colonel Joshua Chamberlain's 20th Maine.
They run out of ammunition.
Completely out of ammo. And they execute this desperate bayonet charge down the hill. And that singular action preserves the entire Union line.
And that little detail, that bayonet charge, it shows you how fine the margins were here if the Confederates take that hill on day 2.
The whole Union position collapses. It's untenable, the battle's over, and it's a Confederate victory.
But the line held, and because it held, Lee was forced into the decision on July 3rd that, ultimately cost him the war.
Which brings us to Pickett's charge.
Let's go back to the numbers, because that 50,000 casualty number, it doesn't quite capture how lopsided the destruction really was.
No, it doesn't. So the Union forces, they lost about 23,000 men, a terrible, terrible number. But the Confederates lost approximately 28,000, and for them that loss was It was irreplaceable.
28,000 men. And a huge chunk of that number comes from one single afternoon, July 3rd.
That's where the focus has to be. Pickett's charge. It was a frontal assault by about 12,500 Confederate soldiers.
Across nearly a mile of open field.
Open, gently rising ground, straight towards the fortified center of the Union line. It was a tactical nightmare. It cost them about 6,000 men in less than 1 hour.
6,000 men in 60 minutes. It's almost impossible to imagine. That concentration of loss, it guaranteed the bigger loss of 28,000 was a death blow.
It was. The Confederacy, with its smaller population, it just could not replace those men, especially the experienced officers who led that charge. The Union could absorb 23,000 casualties. The Confederacy could not absorb 28,000.
And that human cost, it directly leads to the military pivot. So the Union wins, Meade holds the field. What was the immediate result?
The outcome was decisive and immediate. First, the invasion was stopped, dead in its tracks. This was the last time Lee would ever try to take the war north. From this point on, the fighting stays on Confederate soil.
Which puts all that pressure on Southern civilians, on their infrastructure.
And second, Lee was forced into a massive, completely demoralizing retreat back to Virginia.
And this is where that momentum shift really happens, isn't it?
Absolutely. Lee's army, which had been seen as basically invincible, was suddenly battered, crippled. One soldier wrote home that the retreat felt like a funeral march of desperation.
So the military momentum, which had been with the South for so long, it just swings violently and permanently over to the Union.
The strategic initiative was gone. Lee's campaign to win the war, it did the exact opposite. It bled his army dry and gave the Union hope when they needed it most.
But the real nightmare for the Confederacy wasn't just Gettysburg. It was this devastating 1-2 punch that happened just hours later.
Yes. Okay, this is the multiplier effect. This is where the idea of a turning point becomes undeniable.
The timing is just unbelievable.
It is. As awful as Gettysburg was for the Confederacy in the East, the Union won an equally important victory in the West at almost the exact same time.
You're talking about the Siege of Vicksburg.
Yes, on July 4th. The day after the guns went silent at Gettysburg, Confederate forces in Vicksburg, Mississippi surrendered to Ulysses S. Grant.
So let's connect the dots here for you. Lee's army is shattered and retreating in the east. And at the same time, the Union secures total control of the Mississippi River at Vicksburg,
which effectively splits the Confederacy in two. It cuts off Texas, Arkansas, Louisiana, all their men and supplies from the rest of the war.
It's not just one turning point, it's two massive simultaneous turning points.
Exactly. This is the moment the North secures the strategic upper hand for good. From here on out, the Confederacy is fighting a war of attrition it just cannot win.
And then the legacy moves beyond the military map, doesn't it? It becomes part of the political and cultural story of the United States. And you can't talk about that without talking about Lincoln.
And the Gettysburg Address, delivered 4 months later in November of 1863. Lincoln takes this horrific battle and he lifts it into the philosophical realm. He uses that field of death to redefine the entire purpose of the war.
He connects the sacrifice, those 50,000 casualties we keep talking about, directly to the founding ideals of the country.
He does. He reframes the whole war. It's not just about preserving the Union anymore. It's a test of whether a nation conceived in liberty and dedicated to the proposition that all men are created equal can even survive.
That speech cements Gettysburg's place in history. It makes the battle central to the very idea of the modern United States.
It ties the military sacrifice directly to the political and moral future of the nation.
Okay, so let's try and summarize this for you. The 3 core reasons Gettysburg is the definitive turning point. We can lay them out pretty cleanly.
Okay, first, you've got the strategic halt. Lee's invasion fails. His army is crippled, and the war is now permanently confined to the South.
Right. Second, morale and momentum. The North finally gets the win it needs to believe it can win the whole war, and that's amplified by the Vicksburg victory.
And third, it cements the national cause. Vicksburg splits the South geographically, and the Gettysburg Address gives the immense human cost a powerful, unifying, and national meaning.
Which really raises a final thought for you to take away from this deep dive. We've talked so much about the cost, the 50,000 casualties. Think about how that specific, shocking number, that immediate horror, created a mandate for a new idea. How did that sheer level of human sacrifice directly inform the message of national rebirth that Lincoln articulated? And how does that specific human cost continue to shape what America means today? You know, if you ask almost anyone who studied the Civil War what was the turning point, I mean, they're almost always going to say Gettysburg.
They are. It was the biggest, bloodiest battle fought on the continent. It really did break the back of the Confederate offensive capability.
But today, we're not really going to focus on the sweeping drama of the battle. We're actually going to look inside the command tent.
That's exactly right. Our mission today is a bit more surgical. We're going to dissect the Confederate defeat by looking at detailed analysis that focuses almost entirely on the decisions of one man, Robert E. Lee.
Okay.
We've got sources that pinpoint four really distinct errors, tactical and operational, that just compounded on each other over those 3 days.
Right. So the goal here is to get past the simple summary of what happened. We want to dig into why a commander with Lee's reputation, his genius, made these specific mistakes. It's a deep dive into how things like management style and communication breakdowns can totally unravel a campaign.
And what you see right away from this material is how quickly a high-stakes plan can just fall apart because of ambiguity.
Okay, so let's unpack this. The first critical error, and this one seems like it was maybe the most devastating on an operational level, was this failure to maintain situational awareness. Lee was essentially fighting blind leading up to the battle, and it was all because of a breakdown with his army's eyes and ears, the cavalry.
The mishandling of J.E.B. Stuart and his cavalry, it was absolutely critical. This isn't just about losing a couple of scouts.
No.
We're talking about losing a massive screening force. And our sources really highlight that the orders Lee gave Stuart they were fundamentally ambiguous. That's what set the stage for failure.
Ambiguous how? I mean, that sounds a little too simple for such a huge intelligence failure.
Well, Lee gave Stuart two objectives, but with no clear priority between them. First, he was supposed to scout, find the Union Army of the Potomac, report where it's going. But second, he was also given this really wide latitude to ride north, gather supplies, and, harass the enemy.
So wait, he basically told his top intelligence officer, go find the single most important piece of information I need, but also, hey, go on this kind of glorious, profitable adventure at the same time.
Exactly. And those two things are immediately in conflict.
Right.
And Stuart, being the kind of aggressive, maybe fame-seeking commander he was, he prioritized the second objective, the raid.
Of course.
So instead of keeping the main Confederate army screened and informed, he takes his whole division on this wide ride around the eastern flank of the Union Army.
And the consequence of that communication failure is that Lee is completely in the dark.
Completely. He has no idea where General Meade is or which way he's heading.
Yeah.
Lee's marching north, thinking he's going to find the enemy on his own terms. But the whole time, the Union Army has already crossed the Potomac and is closing in fast.
That lack of intelligence, it must have just created total chaos.
It did. Lee was planning for what military historians call a strategic concentration. He wanted this carefully orchestrated meeting of his army at a point he'd chosen.
On ground he'd picked out.
Yes. Instead, he just stumbles into an unplanned meeting engagement at Gettysburg on July 1st.
Can you just explain that distinction for everyone listening? What's the real practical difference between a planned concentration and a meeting engagement like that?
It's basically the difference between planning a surprise party and running into a stampede.
Okay.
In a planned concentration, you control the time, the terrain, your troops are ready. In a meeting engagement, you are just reacting. Lee's forces stumbled into Gettysburg not because it was great strategic ground, but because they were trying to protect their supply lines and road junctions.
So they started the fight already on the back foot, fighting reactively from the very beginning.
From moment one. And that's such a profound point. The poor communication didn't just cause a bit of confusion, it literally determined the entire operational reality on the ground.
So that's the first huge error, strategic blindness. And you're saying it didn't stop there.
No, absolutely not.
Yeah.
This problem of ambiguity, it wasn't just limited to Stuart. This failure flowed right into the tactical failures on the battlefield because Lee made the same kind of communication error with his corps commanders.
Which brings us to the second critical error you mentioned, the breakdown in subordinate orders. The sources all point to this one phrase Lee kept using.
If practicable.
If practicable.
That phrase. You could argue it's the most costly piece of language in the entire campaign. It sounds like, sensible professional latitude.
Right, like you're trusting your commanders.
But in the heat of battle, it allowed commanders like Richard Ewell and A.P. Hill to hesitate when Lee desperately needed them to be aggressive.
If practicable is just a killer phrase, isn't it? Because it basically gives your subordinate a veto. They can just decide it's too risky or too hard.
It's a huge gray area where delay suddenly becomes acceptable. And you see the consequences immediately on the first day. The Confederates had routed the Union forces. They had them on the run.
And they had a chance to seize the high ground.
A golden opportunity. After the initial success on July 1st, Lee sends orders to Ewell to take Cemetery Hill and Culp's Hill, if practicable.
And what does Ewell do?
He hesitates. The sources suggest he was worried about the late hour, how hard it would be to organize an assault through the town. He was also worried about a counterattack on his flank, so he decided it just wasn't practicable that evening.
But that was a fatal mistake.
Absolutely fatal. That one lost opportunity basically defined the terrain for the entire rest of the battle. If they'd taken those hills, the whole dynamic would have shifted.
The Union would have been attacking uphill against prepared positions instead of the other way around.
So this raises a big question. Why was Lee, who was known for being so aggressive, so loose with his commands here?
And our sources point to a failure to adapt his leadership style to his new team.
Exactly. After Stonewall Jackson died, Jackson was this uniquely aggressive commander who just got Lee's intent.
Right. He would have taken the hill without a second thought.
He probably would have. But Lee's new commanders, Ewell and Hill, they were solid generals, but they didn't have that same instinct for hyper-aggression.
And Lee was reluctant to micromanage them.
Yes. He trusted his generals, but that trust, when it was expressed through these vague orders, it just amplified the confusion. He needed to be explicit, but instead he gave them room for caution.
That's a huge leadership lesson right there.
Well,
Trust is important, but clear, non-negotiable direction is, everything when the stakes are that high.
and that failure to seize the advantage, that stagnation on the first 2 days, leads directly to the defining and most disastrous tactical decision of the whole war.
Pickett's charge.
Pickett's charge. It's just a textbook example of failing to respect the terrain and the enemy's position. After failing to get around the Union flank on day 2, Lee decides to just double down on a massive frontal assault.
He orders nearly 13,000 men to march across almost a mile of open ground.
Straight into the center of the Union line, which was dug in on high ground on Cemetery Ridge.
It's just a tactical absurdity.
It is. The sources are clear that Lee ignored these 3 critical disadvantages that made the attack basically hopeless before it even started. First, the distance. They had to cross something like 1,400 yards of open ground.
With no cover.
No cover whatsoever. That's the second point, the terrain. And the third, and maybe the most fatal factor, was the Union's artillery placement.
Right. They were in that fish hook defensive line, so they could just rake that open field with cannon fire.
Perfectly sighted. They could hit them from the front and the flank. Lee was gambling that this huge preliminary artillery barrage would knock out the Union guns.
But that failed too, right? The Confederate artillery preparation, it was a disaster.
It was poorly coordinated. And crucially, a lot of the Confederate shells just overshot the Union infantry and landed harmlessly behind their lines. So when the charge finally started, the Union batteries were essentially untouched. And they just opened up a devastating fire on those exposed columns.
So you're sending thousands of men marching across what's basically a mile-long shooting gallery toward an entrenched enemy on high ground whose cannons are all still working.
It violates every basic principle of an infantry assault. The result was just carnage. The charge failed completely. They took something like 50% casualties.
50%.
It just shattered those divisions and sealed the outcome of the battle. It was the ultimate gamble that didn't pay off, and it cost the Confederacy thousands of veteran soldiers it just couldn't replace.
So we have this chain reaction. Strategic blindness leads to a reactive battle, which is then made worse by vague commands, which then culminates in this disastrous frontal assault. But if the tactical fight was lost there, we have to zoom out. What about the whole operational strategy that brought them to Gettysburg to begin with? This is the fourth error.
This is where we shift from the mistakes on the field to the fundamental strategic error. The sources argue that Lee needlessly converged his whole army at Gettysburg.
Wait, needlessly. I thought the whole point was to take the fight north, put pressure on Lincoln. How could fighting the enemy be needless?
It wasn't that the invasion was needless, it was the location of the fight. Lee had successfully maneuvered his army deep into Pennsylvania. He was actually north of the Union Army.
Okay, so he had a superior position.
He did. But by choosing to concentrate and fight at this small town, Gettysburg, which was really just a hub for some roads, he accepted a massive, decisive battle on ground that offered him no real strategic value.
So what were the alternatives he was ignoring? What should he have done?
The alternative, the higher value targets, were major northern cities. Harrisburg, the capital of Pennsylvania, was within reach.
A state capital.
A state capital with critical rail lines and factories. Or he could have even threatened Philadelphia. A move like that would have forced the Union Army to scramble defensively to protect those vital assets.
That's a classic choice, right? Do you prioritize military ground, or do you go for the political and logistical objectives? By choosing Gettysburg, he just fights a battle. By choosing Harrisburg, he threatens the North's entire will to fight.
Exactly. Lee's main strategic goal for the whole campaign was political. He wanted to force Lincoln into peace talks. By converging on Gettysburg, he gave up the chance to do that with maneuver and threat. He traded a high-value strategic option for a high-cost tactical fight over some roads.
So the fourth error was really choosing the wrong objective for the final fight, a tactical choice over a strategic one.
Precisely. That decision turned what could have been a sustained operational threat into a short, bloody tactical defeat that just bled his army dry.
When you put all four of these errors together, it's a terrifying chain reaction of command failure, and it all seems to stem from the top. Can we just quickly synthesize that for everyone listening?
Yeah, it's a perfect case study in cascading failure. First, you have the strategic blindness from the ambiguous cavalry orders. Yeah. Second, the breakdown in command from vague language like, if practicable, which leads to hesitation and losing the high ground. Third, the terrible tactical execution of Pickett's charge.
And then fourth,
underpinning it all, the flawed strategic choice to fight a decisive battle at Gettysburg at all when bigger political targets were on the table.
It's just sobering to think that a commander like Lee made these four massive compounding errors almost at the same time. It really shows how even the most brilliant leaders are vulnerable to these kinds of management and communication failures.
And this knowledge is most valuable when you can apply it. For you, the listener, these details about communication failures, the danger of ambiguity, the need for clear direction with a new team, it shows how management problems on the battlefield are just as critical as courage or logistics.
The consequences are just amplified under fire. The margin for error is basically zero when lives are on the line.
The sources really emphasize that by converging on Gettysburg, Lee threw away a potential operational success. So here's something for you to consider. What if the cavalry had delivered clear intelligence? And what if Lee had aimed for Harrisburg instead, forcing the Union Army to react to him? Would that political pressure on Lincoln have changed the war's trajectory, even without a major battle?
That is something to mull over. The power of clear objectives and decisive command. Thank you for diving deep with us.
Okay, so let's really dig into this. We're looking at what might be the most important 72 hours in American history, that window in early July of 1863.
It's true. For anyone who studies the Civil War, this period, this flashpoint is almost always seen as the turning point.
The decisive one.
Absolutely. And it's a moment that, it gets summarized a lot, but we rarely analyze the sheer simultaneity of it all. We are, of course, talking about the Union victories at Gettysburg and Vicksburg.
And that's our mission for this deep dive, right? To unpack why these two events happening almost back to back were such a perfect storm that just crippled the entire Confederate strategy.
The timing is, it's just astounding when you look at it.
It really is.
Okay.
Gettysburg, the big climax of Lee's invasion of the North, it wraps up on July 3rd. And then Vicksburg, the absolute key to the Mississippi River, surrenders the very next day, July 4th.
It was a devastating 1-2 punch. That's the perfect way to put it. I mean, before these 2 days, the war was still very much up in the air. The North had taken some really painful defeats, and European intervention was still a real possibility. After the entire strategic landscape it shifts. Confederate offensive stop cold, Northern morale, it skyrockets, and the South's entire logistical plan is basically neutralized overnight. We need to look at how each victory delivered its own specific crippling blow.
Let's start with Gettysburg then, the Eastern Theater. That's where the most immediate, the most intense military drama was. This was all about Robert E. Lee's goals.
It was. This wasn't just some battle over a piece of land. This was Lee's big, ambitious, almost existential invasion of the North.
He had a ton of momentum, right? Coming off that huge win at Chancellorsville.
Immense pressure and momentum. He felt he needed a major decisive stroke. His objective was grand, He wanted to force the Union Army into a final battle, ideally near a big northern city, to pressure Washington, maybe get that European recognition.
Just make the northern public give up on the war.
Exactly. It was a huge political and military gamble, and the battle itself was, well, the largest ever fought in North America.
But the key moment, the one that really broke the offensive, was on that last day, July 3rd. We have to talk about Pickett's charge.
Pickett's charge really encapsulates the whole disaster for the Confederacy. After 2 days of just brutal, bloody fighting that hadn't really decided anything, Lee commits nearly 15,000 men to a frontal assault straight into the teeth of the Union Center on Cemetery Ridge.
Just straight across open ground.
For 3/4 of a mile. It was an act of profound, almost desperate faith in his army, and the slaughter that followed, it was the ultimate strategic failure.
And it wasn't just a tactical loss on the field, was it? It was bigger than that.
Oh, much bigger. It completely extinguished their strategic ambition. The Army of Northern Virginia had to retreat back to Virginia immediately. Their mission had totally failed. That single defeat ended any realistic hope that the Confederacy could ever win a decisive victory on Union soil again.
That hope died right there on July 3rd.
It did. And that strategic problem is directly tied to the cost, the manpower. People often focus on the number, over 28,000 Confederate casualties, but the real issue was the quality of the men they lost.
These weren't new recruits.
No, these were the best of the best, irreplaceable veteran commanders, sergeants, guys who had been the backbone of Lee's army for 2 years.
So how quickly did that really force them onto the defensive? I mean, the war went on for another 2 years. Couldn't Lee have mounted another offensive?
Not like that one. He couldn't. The Confederacy's pool of available men was just too shallow. They could replace a rifle, but they couldn't replace a 2-year veteran who knew how to lead a squad under fire. The loss of that elite corps meant Lee was permanently blocked from trying any more northern campaigns on that scale. The result was this forced, irreversible strategic shift. The Confederacy was now locked into fighting a purely defensive war in the East.
So they were fighting just to survive, but they'd lost the ability to actually win.
Precisely.
Okay, so Gettysburg breaks the South's strategic ambition in the East. Now let's pivot, both in time and geography, to the West. This is where General Grant achieves a victory that's, well, it's less about battlefield drama and more about a logistical knockout, Vicksburg.
Which fell on July 4th, 1863. Just as Lee's retreat was really getting underway.
It's amazing.
And what's so fascinating is that while Gettysburg stopped the enemy from moving forward, Vicksburg, it surgically divided and starved the enemy.
Because Vicksburg was the last major Confederate stronghold on the Mississippi River.
The very last one. For the Union to enforce its grand strategy, the Anaconda Plan, it had to get full, total control of that river.
And Grant's campaign to get there. It was a masterclass, but it wasn't easy. He failed a few times.
He did, but he finally succeeded by taking these huge risks, running his gunboats past those massive Confederate batteries on the bluffs at night, then cutting his army loose from its own supply lines for this daring overland campaign.
That showed some serious strategic confidence.
A profound confidence. He fought this brilliant series of battles, separated the Confederate forces, and drove the defenders right back into Vicksburg. Then he just settled in for a siege.
For almost 7 weeks.
Right. And when General Pemberton finally surrendered, it was because his men were literally starving and totally cut off.
Okay, so let's really break down that strategic outcome. The Union gets the Mississippi. But let's stress the logistical devastation here. How does gaining a river literally split the Confederacy in two?
It's all about resource flow. The Confederacy depended heavily on its states west of the river, Texas, Arkansas, parts of Louisiana for vital supplies.
What kind of supplies are we talking about?
Think about it. Texas was the main source of beef, corn, leather, salt, and crucially, horses for the cavalry for all the armies fighting in the East.
And that river, which had been their highway, suddenly becomes a wall.
An impassable barrier, exactly. The Union now had a complete blockade on the water. Resources from the Trans-Mississippi just couldn't get across safely anymore. Lee's army was instantly cut off from a critical supply basin.
Wow. It was a logistical blow that guaranteed they'd run out of stuff in the long run.
It did. The Trans-Mississippi regions were isolated from supply lines, isolated from reinforcements. All their vital communications were severed.
So the Confederacy is basically dismembered. And on the flip side, this must give in the North a huge advantage in moving their own supplies.
An unparalleled advantage. The Union could now move men and material from cannons to foodway faster, cheaper, and safer down the Mississippi than they ever could overland. It streamlined their entire war effort.
So within, 24 to 48 hours, the Confederacy is rendered strategically passive in the East. Yeah. And it's geographically and logistically dismembered in the West.
That's it. And that brings us to the synthesis, the combined effect that really cemented this period as the turning point. This wasn't just 2 good days for the Union.
No, it was the simultaneous collapse of 2 completely separate but connected theaters of war for the South.
Right. And the combination immediately it killed any momentum the South had from its earlier wins. I mean, can you imagine the despair in Richmond? They just lost their best defensive army, and they permanently lost their main supply artery.
Morale, which had been so high, must have just cratered.
Utterly cratered. And for the North, it was the exact opposite. War fatigue had been setting in. Dissent was high.
But this 1-2 punch was so effective and so perfectly timed that it completely flipped the narrative. It gave Lincoln and the public this absolute confirmation that victory wasn't just a possibility anymore.
Yeah.
It was just a matter of time.
It rejuvenated Northern resolve overnight. And that extends to the leadership, too. We have to talk about Grant.
Right. His success at Vicksburg was undeniable proof of his brilliance and his tenacity.
His ability to just stick with a massive objective until it was done. He wasn't just winning battles, he was winning strategic infrastructure. And this victory, it elevated him. He was no longer just a regional commander. He was validated on the national stage as the general who understood total war, that you have to destroy the enemy's capacity to fight, not just their army.
And this put him on the path to commanding everything.
It cemented his path. Shortly after, Lincoln puts him in command of all Union forces. So the North finds its winning general just as the South loses its ability to go on the attack.
Okay, so we've got the short-term crisis for the South offensives halted, map split in 2. But the war still drags on until 1865. How does this moment definitively hasten their defeat?
Well, if we connect it to the bigger picture, the fundamental pivot is that forced shift from offense to a prolonged defense, a defensive war of attrition. It requires incredible, unending resources.
Resources the South just didn't have.
They didn't have the industrial base or the logistical setup to sustain it. They were forced to conserve everything rather than dictate the terms of the fight.
And the losses at Gettysburg and the isolation from Vicksburg fed into that.
Directly. The irreplaceable casualties at Gettysburg meant Lee had fewer men for his defensive lines. The isolation from Vicksburg meant those remaining men had fewer supplies, less food, fewer horses. It's a combination that created this immediate and growing economic strain and logistical isolation that, they could never overcome it.
It sounds like the moment the South lost control of its own territory, the clock on its survival just started ticking way, way faster.
That's the takeaway. You could argue the Confederacy was already strategically defeated by the evening of July 4th, 1863. They could no longer run a coordinated, large-scale war. Every year after that just compounded the strain from those 3 critical days.
It's incredible. The whole narrative of the war shifts from this uncertain conflict to really just a sustained Union effort to grind down an enemy that can't strike back effectively or resupply itself.
It became the unambiguous point of no return. These 2 specific, closely timed victories they simultaneously broke the South's operational capability in the West and its strategic ambition in the East. It's hard to find a better example of military history turning on a dime.
And the really interesting point here is how that Vicksburg logistical blow and Gettysburg's forced defense, how they accelerated the defeat through economic strain and isolation, not just through, raw body counts.
Right. And that raises a really important question, something for you, the listener, to think about as you reflect on all this.
Alexa.
How often does fundamental geography like control of a major river or a strategic choke point determine the ultimate winner of a long conflict more profoundly than just the battlefield victories alone? The Mississippi wasn't just a place where Grant won a battle. It was the key to the Confederacy's entire existence.